Hi everyone, welcome to Empowered Journalism. We are a women-led platform uniting and empowering journalists across the globe, and we're really excited to bring this workshop to you today.
We're speaking to Georgia Coan. After starting out in local radio, Georgia undertook a digital journalism apprenticeship with the BBC and is currently working for Newscast. She's worked across radio and podcasting, covering mental health, grief, and lots of other topics affecting younger audiences.
Thank you so much, Georgia, for coming to speak with us today. We heard a little bit just now about your time at the BBC doing a digital apprenticeship, about your time in local radio, but we'd really be interested to know more about your direct route into journalism and when you sort of realised that you wanted to be a journalist.
Yeah, of course. So where do I start? I guess it might be easier to start around the time that I really noticed that I was interested in going into journalism. So I was about 16, maybe 15, 16, and I was in my last year of school. So I was doing my GCSEs, and I started to watch a lot of documentaries. So I was really into Louis Theroux, as is everyone, Stacey Dooley, because she's a fellow Luton girl, so big up Stacey. And I just really loved the idea of storytelling and doing it in a format that was just, I just think is so powerful in journalism, is this idea that you can really dissect a story and speak to people and investigate different issues. And I think for me, that was the moment I was thinking to myself, wow, okay, this is of real interest. But when I look back, I remember being sort of 6, 7 years old and having a little cassette player that I tell everyone this story, but a little cassette player that I used to go around and record interviews of all my, with my guinea pig and with the neighbour's dog and, people around the neighbourhood with this little cassette player. And I think that really, it just goes to show that I think a lot of people that are journalists kind of have similar traits, or probably, they had those personality traits as quite a young person. And I think that's me. I have a real interest for people and their stories and being able to help them tell their stories as well. So that was when I had a real interest to go into journalism anyway. It was kind of, as an adult, I didn't know what a journalist was at 6 years old. But that was, for me, the moment I was like, okay, well, what do I do after school? Where do I go? And there was a creative media course in the local college, and I signed up to do that. And that was about 2 years, and you got a BTEC in creative media. One of the units was on journalism, which is obviously why I applied for it. But I got to do a range of different things: directing, music videos, adverts, productions. So it was a bit of everything, really. But for me, the journalism was always my main interest, and I was part of the college magazine as well. So we'd go out and do stories about the community. And I ended up going to university, but I only went for a year, and I had to drop out due to personal circumstances. And I remember at the time just assuming that that was it, and that I was never going to be able to go into journalism, and I'd kind of like written myself off, basically. And ended up going into doing a bit of digital journalism and not digital journalism, sorry, digital marketing. So I was doing some social media bits for local companies and just, really small scale stuff. And then I decided, actually, you know what, I still love journalism. This is where I want to be. I'm going to go in, and which shows that, rejection, you have to kind of ignore it and just put it to the side and think, okay, I'm going to continue doing what I'm doing, because eventually it pays off. And I applied for some work experience at Three Counties Radio and did that for 2 weeks. And then conveniently, about a month or so later, they then advertised the digital journalism apprenticeships, and our year was the 2016 cohort. So that was, I think, the third apprenticeship that they'd done. So it was still relatively new. And I applied for that. And I think because of the fact that I'd done 2 weeks of work experience, but also I'd done a little bit of freelance, like little projects here and there for Three Counties, I knew the people, I knew the way that it worked. I was basically very knowledgeable about local. And I think that put me in a really good place, because when I went to my interview and my assessment day, I had a real good idea of the types of stories that we were working at, the types of audiences that we'd be catering for. And that was the moment where I ended up getting the digital journalism apprenticeship. Didn't really know whether I was going to get it or not. You hope that you will, but I think there's always a little bit of doubt in your mind as to whether that's actually going to happen or not. And then ended up finding out that I'd got a place. So there was 7 of us, all based around different local radio stations. And it was about 22 months, and you get your NCTJ, and you also get your work experience as well, because obviously you're working in local radio. And I did a few placements in network as well. So worked on Jeremy Vine's show for a week, worked on what used to be the Victoria Derbyshire show for 2 weeks. And got loads and loads of experience. So that was my way in, basically.
Yeah, so it sounds like you had like a really, really varied, on that apprenticeship, it offered you a really varied experience, I guess. And what would you say, Georgia, is the best piece of advice that you were given? It can be early or like from more recently in your career. What do you think the best piece of advice someone's ever given you has been?
Oh, that is such a good question. I think that actually a lot of the time, the best bit of advice, I'm trying to kind of pinpoint one bit that I would say has really stuck with me. But I think the general bit of advice that people will often give you in the industry is that your passion is what will get you to where you want to be. It's not necessarily level of experience. It's not necessarily your connections to the industry. I think a lot of people do worry that the industry is only for a certain type of person, and that you have to be friends with someone in order to get jobs, and you have to have those connections. I think networking is a big part of working in the industry, but I speak from personal experience as someone who I would consider myself to be from a working class background. I don't have connections to the industry. I didn't have connections to the industry, sorry, obviously I do now. But when I first came in, I didn't have people in my family that were in the industry. No one I know was a journalist. And so I think networking is so important, but it's actually just as simple sometimes as just dropping someone a message on Twitter. And I know Twitter is kind of very valuable, I think, to journalists. And I know that we obviously talk about using those platforms quite a lot, but actually sometimes just reaching out to a fellow journalist or someone that you admire and saying, I really like your work. Could you give me some advice, or do you know of any jobs going, or stuff like that actually that person might have that time to give to you and really help you get into the industry. Because that's really how I got that's how I got the work experience, really, is because I went in to do an interview on the local so at Three Counties they had the lunchtime show, and I went in and I was asked to do an interview about grief and about my personal experience, because I started writing a blog at that point. That's also another bit of advice that I would give. If you have not yet started working in the industry and you've maybe not got a massive not massive profile, but you've not got a portfolio full of work, it's a really good idea maybe to set up a blog or to set up a YouTube channel, just to kind of showcase the types of stuff that you want to do and the work that you've already done, even if it's like small scale stuff where it's just you've worked for a local company and you've written some copy for their website. That is really helpful as well. And so when I went to go and do this interview for the lunchtime show, the presenter afterwards said to me, you're really knowledgeable about the area, you know lots about the community, because I was doing a bit of community work here and there. He said, you should come and do some work experience for us, like you would be great working in this office. And I think sometimes it just takes someone recognizing that in you and pushing you to do that, and almost like saying, you need to do this, for you to really realize, okay, this is for me, this is where I want to be. And I think that is the one thing I would say that I had at that point without experience. I didn't have qualifications, I didn't have any experience in the journalism industry, but I had passion, and I had the core skills, which are an interest in people's stories, an interest in the community, a nose for a story, in essence, wanting to go out and find different people and find different stories. And on the second week of my work experience, I think it was the first week, I was sent to go and do some reporting on quite a sensitive story about a local man who had ended up in a coma after a situation where these men had attacked him, and it was the family kind of speaking out on injustice. And I remember at the time thinking, I'm not even qualified to do this. I feel like it's completely out of my depth. And they just passed me a microphone and went, all right, off you go. And I went on the Saturday to go and meet this family who were protesting kind of in Luton town centre. And I just remember thinking, well, I might not have the experience. You know, I'm not a seasoned reporter. I've not done anything like this before. But at the same time, I'm passionate and I want to do this and I want to tell this family story. And I think that if you have that is the core skill, and those core skills can then be built on as time goes on, and you can become you become a better journalist with time. There's no question about it. But yeah, I think for me, that passion is, keep that passion and use that to your advantage is the best bit of advice that I can give.
I think that's really good advice, and I think so much of that is just about how the industry is so concerned with connecting with people,
whether that be within the industry, which a lot of journalists just have that connection with people.
So I think there's so much to take away there, just both in terms of how to get around in the industry, but also how to become a good journalist in terms of connecting with people there as well. So moving on a little bit to the future of the industry in this very, very fast-paced and ever-changing industry. Obviously, you do a lot of work with podcasts at the BBC, and I was just really interested to know, how influential do you think podcasts have been in the journalism industry, and what do you think their future might be?
So weirdly, I actually got into podcasting at the point where the BBC had literally just started doing it. So when I say they started doing it, I mean kind of original productions. BBC Sounds launched when I started working on podcasts. So I think at that point, the BBC really caught on to the fact that creating these original podcasts rather than, I think we had podcasts before that were radio shows that were recut for that purpose, not so much actual, original ideas and podcasts that were created exclusively for the BBC. And I ended up working on Beyond Today, or what was to become Beyond Today, because I was working on the pilot. I think it was towards the end of my apprenticeship, actually. We all got an email saying, does anyone want to come and work on this podcast? And I'm ashamed to say it, but I say I'm ashamed, but I didn't even know what a podcast was at that point. I mean, that was kind of early 2018, I think mid 2018. And I think I knew, I'd heard of podcasts, like I knew certain podcasts, but I didn't really know much about the industry and I didn't really know how it worked. And so I just went, okay, I'd love to take this opportunity, because it was an opportunity to work for Radio 4, and it was like, wow, okay, that for me sounds like a really exciting opportunity to take. And then I ended up working on the pilot for Beyond Today for, I think it was altogether 4 weeks, and then it got commissioned. And as I say, this was around the time that BBC Sounds was also about to launch. So we hadn't really done a daily news podcast before at the BBC. And so this was completely new, and Beyond Today was one of the top podcasts that were going to be launched alongside BBC Sounds. And I think the main reason why that podcast even happened was because the editor, John Shields, he had gone to America, and he'd spent about a year over in America, and then he'd come back and he'd realised how big daily news podcasts were in America. And he came back and he was like, okay, we should do something like this in the UK. And then, it started to catch on. You got Today in Focus, and then, you've got all these other daily news podcasts that have become quite popular since then. But at the time, there was nothing really like that. And I think that the BBC have started to realise that, and a lot of media companies, not just BBC, but I think we've slowly started to realise that actually podcasts are a great way to connect with audiences, because unlike radio is there, and you can't really choose what you listen to. Well, you can choose what you listen to on the radio. You can choose to listen to radio on Radio 2, whatever. But you can't really cater or listen to specific topics or discussions. And the great thing about podcasts is that they're customized, in essence, to what people want and what people need at the time. And you can drop in and drop out of an episode, and you can listen to an episode depending on the types of topics that you want to learn about. And I think that that's what's so great about podcasting. And I feel like it's just going to build and build and build. And I know that, podcasting's been around for some time. It's not a new concept, but in America, I feel it's obviously quite big. Still is massive, and the UK is kind of in essence catching up to that a little bit at the moment. But I generally feel that it's just going to get bigger and bigger as time goes on. I mean, some of the podcasts that the BBC have produced, especially story-led podcasts as well, are just absolutely amazing. The production and the work that goes into it. The podcast that was made the other year with Panorama, I'm Not a Monster, which was about an ISIS bride from America who basically had moved over to join her husband who was fighting for ISIS. And I think the whole premise of that, the way that it was created and the way that it was such a story-led podcast. I think just the way that it was put together was amazing. It really shows just how great the BBC is in terms of these, telling a story in a long-form platform, which I think is probably the future of where we're going, and we're becoming more digital at the moment because we know just how important it is, and that audiences really engage with stuff when they can kind of connect with it on their phone, or when they're going through social media and it pops up on Twitter or Instagram or whatever. And again, podcasting, you can literally, if you're commuting, well, obviously you're probably not commuting at the moment, but before, if you're commuting to work, you can just put an episode on for 20 minutes or whatever, or half an hour, and that's you sorted for the day, and you can learn about your news stories in one episode, similar to what we do at Newscast. So yeah, I just think it's going to get bigger and better, more hopefully more original story-led ideas are commissioned, and over time I just think that that's the way that things are going to end up, and we're going to go into that more digital world, I think.
So obviously from like a listener's point of view, podcasts have become huge over lockdown. I think everyone's they were growing anyway, but I think everyone's appreciated the chance to have some time to sit and actually now have the time to listen to podcasts, I guess. But from a production point of view, it would be really interesting to know, with working from home on something like that, or just working through a pandemic, as well as the barriers that you faced, have there been any positives that have come out of having to kind of do that all remotely? Or
yeah, I think so. So at the beginning of the pandemic, we still had a podcast called The Next Episode, which has now been replaced with another product. But the next episode was aimed at younger audiences, and we do kind of small scale investigations. Now, that was more difficult to do from home because the whole concept of that podcast is that you go out and you speak to people and you travel around and you get out of London and you do things, and that was quite difficult to do when you have to do that all over Zoom, but we adapted to it and we made it work, and we were using kind of experimenting with different programs and different ways of doing things, and I think that is really helpful because even when the pandemic ends, it means that you have an understanding of how that works, and if we continue to have some kind of hybrid situation where some days we work from home, then we know that it is workable, which I think is really great, and also shows that remote working, you can be anywhere in the country and you don't have to move to London as everyone expects people to do, because actually look, for the last year people have made it work without having to be in those places. But then when I went across to Newscast, so again I've been working from home pretty much exclusively since last March, since the end of last March, so it's all a bit of a whirlwind, but the way that we've made it work on Newscast, I think we've adapted to it so well, because our presenter Adam, he still goes into the studio, so he'll be there with a sound engineer, but a lot of the producers work from home. So we have someone on our team who still lives up north and they get, they work from home. I live in Dunstable, which is near Luton, and I pretty much, as I say, exclusively work from home. So we make it work, and actually a lot of the time it's the producers can work from home because we set up the program, we put bids in, we write briefs, and we can do that from home. And then when we're recording the interview, they get us up on the phone, we listen to it, we edit, and then the way that the system is built now means that it's a lot easier for people to not have to be in the office. And actually I hope that not just BBC but across the media industry that is a bit of a learning curve, because as we know, there are colleagues, so for example disabled colleagues that might have accessibility issues. The fact that it's been shown that people can work from home and that actually it still works, and I'm not saying for everyone, I think for TV it's probably a lot more difficult, and we're quite lucky that in audio it is a little bit more of a simple process. But I think it just shows you that you can do it, and that that option is there. And I just think that in the future that might be a little bit more, I guess it's more of an option than it was before. I think now that we've shown that you can do it, and it's proven that you can do it, and I just think that it's a great opportunity to have people from all across the country working for you who have that experience but don't necessarily have the money or the resources to move to London. And as you know, the BBC are quite big on moving stuff out of London now, and I just think that that's really important, because it means that we have a much more diverse workforce and people are not London centric. So yeah, I hope that we, in some elements, we, not just my team, I just mean BBC in general, that we kind of learn from this and that we use a lot of those elements and continue to use them in the future, hopefully.
That's really, really nice to hear something positive about the pandemic as well.
In such a fast-paced industry, I think that's one thing that just took so much time to catch up. So it's a good thing.
Exactly. And I think that I will say, though, I do feel really, I don't want to be 100% positive, as in, because I know that there are young journalists who have really struggled with it. And I can imagine, I look back and I think, gosh, I wouldn't have been able to do half the things that I did if we were living through a pandemic at the moment. So actually sometimes I do feel really bad for young journalists who can't go into the office to do work experience and maybe don't have the same opportunities. But actually, on a more positive side, I have heard of young journalists who have found it really helpful, because local radio stations have allowed them to do projects at home, or allowed them to, magazines have allowed them to write from home and do stuff remotely. And actually, I just hope that that becomes a little bit more of a commonplace in the industry, because you don't necessarily have to be in the office, or even in certain cities, major cities, to be able to work in journalism. And I just hope that that becomes a bit more commonplace, really.
Yeah, I definitely think the pandemic has been very bittersweet. Like, it's been harder to get work experience, but without the pandemic, I wouldn't be here right now, I think, with Empowered Journalism. So it's very interesting.
It's balancing it out, isn't it, really? I mean, like, I guess we all wish that, no, everyone wishes it hadn't happened, but I guess we have to deal with the cards. We have to have, is that the word? Is that a saying? You have to deal with the cards you're dealt with. So yeah, you have no other option, really, isn't it? Like, you kind of have to find a way to make it work for you. And I really am just so impressed by some of the young journalists at the moment that reach out to me on social media, and that I follow online, because it's just amazing the work that they put out, and just the fact that they have continued despite what's happened and just found a way to make it work for them, I think is really admirable.
Yeah, I think it's amazing. So I think you just mentioned that some people are allowed to do some radio shows from home, and that kind of leads very nicely onto our next question, which discusses some of the similarities or differences between radio and podcasts, because I know you've worked on both, and I was just really interested to know if they're similar, or if they're a bit more different than we might expect.
There are similarities, but they're also very different. So, for example, when I was in local radio, I produced the lunchtime show for a number of months while I was on my apprenticeship, and I also used to BA for the morning show, for our debate show as well, the mid-morning, and had this wealth of experience that I think you can only really get in local radio, in my opinion, because local radio, literally, you have to know everything. And people have the time for you as well. While as in network, you kind of have to be ready to just jump into the deep end. And local radio, I just think, is an amazing place to have connections and get experience, because you can do a bit of everything. So when I was working in radio, I used to, on the lunchtime show, I used to set up 3 guests, 5 days a week, which, believe me, is quite difficult. And I look back and I think, God, how the hell did I do that? Because now, working on Newscast, I might set up sort of 2 guests in a day, alongside obviously writing the briefs. And it's a different kettle of fish, because it's not local radio. It was very much, oh, this person's got a fundraiser, or this person's got a story to tell, but it wasn't kind of the big news stories, if that makes sense. It was kind of, very localized news. And so it was different in that sense. It was probably not as stressful, or not stressful, but it wasn't as fast paced, should we say. So I think the difference between radio and podcasting, I mean, some of the elements are the same. With Newscast, we record it as though it's live. So we will record from, for example, sometimes the times change, but it's usually 6 till 7, and you'll book the interviews for that time, set up Zoom links, etc. The presenter will be in the studio recording those interviews in that time. And then when we edit, it makes it easier because obviously we've recorded it as though it's live. So we just have to slot things together then and put it, obviously we edit the interviews and take out ums and ahs, etc. But so we kind of, it's easier for us to then put it together. Live radio is obviously quite different. I think in some ways it's easier because you just kind of have to chuck something at the wall and hope it sticks. Not in that, but it's very much like, okay, if something goes wrong on live radio, you just have to work with it, and that's it. So I think in essence, it's like, okay, this is the show. Obviously, you learn from it. If something goes wrong, if something doesn't happen, you learn from it, and you make sure that you don't do that in your next episode or whatever. But it's very much, you put your stuff out, you set it all up, it goes out live. If something happens, then, as I say, you learn from it and move on, but there's nothing really much else you can do. Whereas obviously with podcasting, if it's pre-recorded, it means that, you can edit that, and you can take out the bits that you don't want, and you can take out any bits that don't work. So I feel like that it's easier in some senses and more difficult in others, because I don't know whether you've ever had a situation where you've got this amazing interview that's like 15 minutes, and then you've got to cut it down to 6 or 7 minutes. That's really difficult. So as in local radio, obviously you're just like, well, that person's going to be on for 10 minutes and then they're going to leave the studio. So yeah, it's very different, but also there are similarities, just picking up the phone and talking to people, briefing people on what to expect, that's always going to be the same in radio and podcasting. The actual journalism element of it, finding the story and working out kind of what the best angles are and the points that should be made and what the discussion is, that's going to be the same. But the actual, it's like I said earlier, radio is very much, it's like going to a restaurant, right? If you go to a restaurant, a radio is very much like a set menu. This is what you're going to get, and if you don't like it, turn over. Podcasting, people will come for that subject, and we have people, Newscast obviously gets lots of listeners, and we have people that will tune in on a regular basis and will listen to the podcast on a daily basis because they're fans of the podcast, but also it's a way to get news in a more digestible way, with not having to watch the 10 o'clock news every night, basically. And I just feel as though in that essence, they are very different, because the podcast world, podcasts are catered for the audience, and we learn what the audience want. Not saying radio isn't, but yeah, I just think it's slightly different in that essence. But there are, as I say, the actual production of it, there's a lot of similarities, I would say.
Yeah. So just like changing tack a tiny bit, a lot of your work, Georgia, focuses on some pretty sensitive topics like mental health and grief. And do you find that that's something that you have to be very mindful of so that it doesn't impact you? Like, do you have like any tips to try and like separate work from affecting you mentally, or is that something just you deal with?
Yeah, when I worked on the next episode, we did lots of different quite sensitive topics, as you say, mental health. I think we did at least 2 episodes on grief. Obviously, even the mental health side of things, I was the episode that I reported on. We were looking at an inpatient facility. So then you have to deal with topics, around suicide and mental health, etc. And so it is something that, as a journalist, you really have to prepare yourself for. And the one thing that I always say, and I wrote a tweet about this actually a few weeks ago and got quite a lot of response from it, but for me, I think the best, not even skill, the best personality trait that any journalist can have is empathy. And I just think it's so important, especially when you're doing sensitive topics, to to have that empathy and to just be a human being as well. I think sometimes, I don't necessarily think it's journalists' fault, but I think it's probably more in tabloid journalism, but there is this kind of voyeurism to these types of subjects where it's like, okay, we're just going to go in, do this story, not connect with the families, not talk to the families or the people involved, and just go away. And actually that's definitely not the type of journalist that I am. And so, or I want to be. And when I worked on this mental health story, so I went and looked at this inpatient facility in Middlesbrough, and they had lots of issues, and there were lots of families. I think they'd had 2 deaths within the space of very short. It was a very short period of time, basically, between these 2 deaths. And I joined a Facebook group and started talking to the family and building up a relationship with the families and calling them and speaking to them. And I actually think that is the best way to do these types of stories, is actually, rather than just go in, rush your story, maybe, have a quick chat to someone in a family or your case study. Actually, it's about building up a relationship over time. And actually, when you utilize those contacts as well, it's really helpful down the line. If you do a similar story, you know that you have those contacts and those people. And I think that that's really important. So basically building up a relationship with your case studies and really understanding that it will be difficult for them to talk about this. And there's probably stuff that as journalists, we would not want to tell newspapers or any type of media organisation. There's things about our private life that we probably don't want to share. And so we do have to understand that that might be the case for these people as well, is that they don't feel comfortable, and they need to trust you, and you need to build that relationship with them so that they completely understand. I feel like being transparent as well is really important. So letting them know, okay, this is what the story is, this is what we might want from you, asking what might be more difficult for them to talk about, so that if you do talk about that issue, you can kind of prepare them for that beforehand. And actually, I feel as though if you have lived experience as well, sometimes it's easier. Being someone I lost my brother in 2013, so I have maybe more understanding, especially on the grief side of things. I have a bit more understanding of what that person might be going through, and so that sometimes does make it easier. Not that the story's not about me. I'm not going in there saying, oh, by the way, guys, this happened to me. I think that's important to understand that. But I do think that when you have lived experience and understanding, it's like with any story, not just mental health or grief, it's if you come from a certain area or a certain part of the country, you're going to have more understanding of that community than anyone else. And it's the same kind of premise. If you've been through that, or you have an understanding, sometimes it makes it easier for you to know what to say, what the right things are to say, what the wrong things are to say. That being said, you don't have to have gone through those experiences to have empathy. And sometimes it's really I'll give you one example, is that sometimes on T&E, if we were doing a subject that maybe, for example, I didn't really have as much understanding of, I would go to one of my friends or a fellow journalist, and I would ask them a bit more about that if I knew that maybe they had their own experience or they'd done stories about that before, just to kind of broach maybe the language that I should be using, how I should be approaching it. We did stories about the LGBTQ plus community, so that's really important to know the right language to use when you talk to case studies. And the Gypsy Roman traveller community as well, I've done quite a lot with that community for T&E and for Newsbeat as well. So I just feel like you do have to broach all of these subjects in a way that is not, okay, I'm just going to come in here and just take all of your experience and just stick it in an article, or put it all out there and not actually engage with you on a human level, which I think is really important, because we are humans as journalists and we have feelings, and we're not just robots. And I think that actually sometimes when people know that, they're more likely to open up to you and want to speak. On the side of and sorry, I'll just quickly make this point, but when you do these types of stories, it is really important to also have that support as well. So sometimes you're doing these stories by yourself, or you might be doing them with a colleague, and it's better obviously if you're doing it with a colleague, because then you can kind of bounce ideas off with them, or you can talk to them about this, and if it's something that's really sensitive, you can kind of say, how do I approach this, or can I have a chat to you about it, because it might be something that you're worried about. But actually sometimes you might be doing it by yourself if you're working for a small publication or there's not as much support available to you. I think it's really important, and it's groups like yours, it's kind of groups of young journalists out there who can also be a support to other people. I think that's really important, and that you have an opportunity to talk to someone else who understands the industry, because I think sometimes when you talk to friends or family members who aren't in the industry, they just don't get it, which is understandable because they don't work in it. So it's a little bit like, I don't know what to say to you. Well, as if you know other young journalists and you know people in the industry, I just think that's such a good thing to be able to have, because then when you are upset or worried, or maybe you've been quite shocked by something that you've heard, hopefully you have someone that you can go to and ask for advice. So yeah, and it's just important, obviously at BBC we have lots of support as well if we're ever kind of concerned about anything. We have counselling, and we have lots of mental health support for people who might be dealing with quite traumatic stories and experiences. So yeah, I think that it's just important to be able to have people that you can talk to and offload, should we say.
I think that's really good advice, both for handling the stories themselves and the people that you talk with, and also having that vital support network. And thank you so much for sharing some of your own personal experiences as well alongside that. I think you've just really highlighted how important it is, again, to have such a diverse field of journalists, and then people know how to handle those different stories in the right way. And there's lots of people who have expert advice. On a similar No,
I was just going to say that's like so true. That's absolutely so true. Like, it's so important to have people, like a diverse group of people in the industry, not just from different communities or different backgrounds, but like different experiences, because it is, I mean, we always talk about like diversity of thought, which kind of irritates me. I don't like that, because like, people will say that and it will still be the same people, and you can't necessarily get experiences unless you're talking to the people who have first-hand knowledge of that. And yeah, so I think that's such an important point to make, is that's why diversity in media is so important. You're more likely sometimes to open up or want to speak to someone or a journalist who kind of has an understanding or is from the same background as you. And so that, yeah, I just think it's so important to that, those types of journalists have a place in the industry.
Yeah, definitely, exactly. And I think that builds up into a really nice idea of our next question, which is about a publication having trust. There's been a lot of debate recently, I guess, about the BBC and impartiality, and there's been a lot of different stories coming out about that. Is this a skill that you feel you have to constantly remind yourself of, or is it a natural journalistic instinct or something that just comes very naturally to you?
I think this is about any publication really when I talk about this, but when you work for larger organisations, obviously there are so many people that work for, Channel 4, ITV, BBC, like there's so many different people, and we are individuals as well. Yes, okay, we might work for an organisation, but we're not all the same people. Do you know what I mean? We're not all kind of, and I think that's really important to, when you're in journalism, is to understand that you can only be yourself, basically. You can only you have to trust your own instincts, and you have to understand that you are an individual and you are responsible for your own actions and your own integrity, I guess, and you kind of have to understand that. And this is coming back to trust again. There are situations where I know that at the BBC, contributors will be more will trust one journalist more because actually they've made connections in that industry. And for example, when I was working with the Gypsy Roman traveller community, the BBC hadn't really done many stories about that community before, and that meant that they weren't very trusting. A lot of people weren't very trusting of the media, because actually, and rightly so, because you look at programs like My Big Fat Gypsy Wedding, which is just very, very detrimental to the community, because it's using those stereotypes and putting them out and reinforcing misconceptions about the community. And so that, first of all, people are like, oh no, I don't want to speak to the media because I know what you lot are like, and you kind of get tainted with the same brush. It's very much like, oh yeah, you're a journalist who just wants to come in and take advantage or take our stories. And actually, that's why it's so important to develop those relationships and also be yourself as well, and be authentic to who you are and be just a genuine person, because you connect with people more on that level. And also, you need to continue to be professional and understand that you are a journalist, you're not people's friends, and continue that kind of professional relationship, but also show that you're a human being and you want to understand the community and you want to understand where we've gone wrong previously. Not necessarily, BBC, but media in general, where have we gone wrong previously, where we maybe have done stories about this community that were negative, or, because a lot of the time you switch on local radio and there'll be debates about, oh, there's a traveller site in this area and they shouldn't be here and they're trespassing, and there'll be some kind of discussion about that, but you won't actually hear from anyone from the community, which is quite worrying. And I just think that basically, if that really answers the question, I do think that you have to be responsible for yourself as a journalist and understand that we have editorial guidelines that we have to stick to, and we have to but also trust our relationship and tell your story in the right way. And I think that actually that is the best thing that you can do as a journalist, really, is to utilize those relationships and make people understand that when we say the media, it is that sweeping statement, and you're tainting everyone with the same brush. And actually, a lot of us are here because we care about the audience, and that we care about telling people stories, and we care about raising awareness and on different topics and shining a light on injustice. And that is what journalism is at the base of, if you really cut through, that's why journalism was created. It's to really make the public aware of different issues and different communities, and it's just I just think it's so important, and that's why I keep talking about young journalists. I'm just absolutely amazed by all the young talented people that are coming up at the moment who really care and have connections to different communities and have understandings of different issues, and hopefully they will continue to fight the good fight, as they say, for journalism, because I just think it's so important that we don't allow people to kind of say, oh, you journalists, you're all the same, because obviously we're not all the same. And a lot of us, especially I'm sure a lot of people on this call, really care about communities and people's stories, and to say shine a light on issues that need to be highlighted and we wouldn't know about if we didn't have the media. So yeah, I think it's important that everyone just keeps that in their heart when they go into journalism, because I remember, slightly off topic, but I remember when I was training when I was in college, actually, the phone hacking scandal was happening. And obviously when you see that, you just think, oh my God, all these journalists who were involved in phone hacking, etc. And it made you feel like, oh, okay, maybe I shouldn't go into this industry because that's obviously not good. But you forget about the thousands of other amazing journalists there are out there that actually do amazing things. Panorama, the work that Panorama does week in, week out on investigations is absolutely outstanding. And the team that work there works so hard to shine a light and make people aware of injustice across the country and across the world as well. So yeah, I just think that is what journalism is, and we should never forget that.
No, I think that's really important, and I think a lot of people can relate to there being like the sort of narrative of all journalists are terrible people because of a very small minority. Just conscious of not taking up too much of your time, Georgia, I think we should just move on to some questions from people listening in.
Yeah, of course.
So Eva is wondering if you have any advice for the girls, of which Sanjana is one, working on the Empowered Journalism podcast.
Oh, so I would say I think discussion-led podcasts are are really popular at the moment and are kind of the way forward. I think that actually it's really nice, that idea that you can listen to a podcast and you feel as though you're in that conversation and you're being involved in it, and it's kind of, you're sitting in the pub with a bunch of mates talking about subjects. I personally think that actually a lot of the time those podcasts are really great because you find out bits of information that you probably wouldn't have ever known about, because, you know, those topics that you have on your podcast are probably topics that you would just be having kind of, I don't know, in, as I say, in the pub or over a lunch break, but it's being recorded and it's out there for other people to listen to and other people to relate to. So I think that the best bit of advice, production, should I do production wise, or should I just like the general podcast kind of?
I mean, I guess whatever you think, like, people just getting into podcasting would best need to know, I guess.
Okay, so when you first get into podcasting, I think the best thing that you can do is understand your audience and understand who you are catering that podcast for, because actually everything should be built around your audience. I feel like, unfortunately, there's a little bit of a situation in the podcast industry where we have so many podcasts being made, because the positives of a podcast and negatives it's very similar, because the positive is that anyone can make one, and that's amazing, but the negatives is, because everyone can make one, the market is massively oversaturated. So actually I feel like when you have not a niche podcast, you know, Empowered Journalism, you are catering to young people who want to get into the journalism industry, and actually that in essence really helps you, because you can have you have an idea of what types of topics people are interested in, and you can put out a poll on social media to say who cares about this subject, or who wants to listen to this, or who wants to hear about that, and you can get feedback directly from your audience, which I think is amazing. If your audience is too big, as in you're catering for, I don't know, 18 to 55-year-old in the UK, you know, like this massive audience, you don't really know who your audience is. So you don't know who you're catering for, and it's very difficult to then get a response from your audience and understand what they want from you. So that's what I would say, is like, always keep in mind who your audience is, cater your podcast for them, and get feedback directly, because that is, I think, the best way to do it. And then you're making content that people actually want to listen to and people are really interested in. So
thank you so much. I think that's really valuable for all of us to know. And actually, something that you mentioned there about discussion-led podcasts and topics that you just talk about, like when you're at the pub, I actually think that sums up our podcast quite well, because ours is Empowered Opinions, and Caitlin had sent me a question privately, who is another one of our podcast hosts, talking about how we have such a range of topics. Like we did one on vaccine passports, we also have one on Pride Month coming out on Sunday. But I think that one unifying theme is sort of topics that people are just talking about, generally current topics that people just talk about at the pub. So that's something I think we'll definitely take on board.
Yeah, and you know, if you've ever been to a pub with a journalist, if the group that I work with, we went down the pub, you'd just be talking about everything. You know, you'd be talking about Dominic Cummings, you'd be talking about vaccines, you'd be talking about literally everything under the sun. And that's the great thing about, if you're making a podcast for journalists are in essence interested by everything. So it's a very easy audience to cater for, thankfully.
Yeah, definitely. Building on podcasts, but more about getting a foot in the door, Caitlin has also asked, are there opportunities for young journalists to pitch podcast ideas or get involved with podcasting with the BBC in any way at the moment, as far as you know?
Yeah, so there are, when we were at Beyond Today, we would often get people from outside the BBC who would pitch ideas, and sometimes actually they did end up getting their ideas out there. So we had her last name evades me, but we had a great journalist called Layla who had pitched an idea about knife crime, and they basically went, yeah, okay, that sounds great, come and make an episode for us. And actually sometimes it's as simple as just messaging the editor or just someone who works in that team and saying, I've got an idea, how do I go about pitching it? Newscast is obviously a bit different because we do daily news stories, so we don't really do original journalism, so we don't kind of do our own stories, and that means that kind of, you know, unless the story is already out there, we don't necessarily kind of take pitches as such. Obviously we take suggestions, you know, someone emails and says, oh, can you do this story, I've seen lots about it, then obviously we have those conversations and talk about doing it. But yeah, there are opportunities a lot of the time. Sometimes it's better to pitch to independent companies as well. If you have connections to indies who make productions for BBC, sometimes that's a great way to get in, because they're the connection into the BBC, basically. Because I think the BBC is such a big place that sometimes when you don't work there and you just reach out to someone, you don't know whether you're going to get a reply back. But there are also some amazing and really helpful people at the BBC. Like, I remember there's a guy that works on our team now called Daniel, and he actually messaged me like at the beginning of the pandemic. He didn't work at BBC at that point, he was still at university, and he messaged me and he was like, oh, I really want to do some freelance shifts, is there any available? At that point, obviously it was very early in the pandemic, so we didn't even know, so we were like, oh, I just messaged him and I was like, I'm really sorry, I don't know whether we're going to even have freelance staff at the moment. But he like continued to stay in contact. Then he started doing, I found that he was like freelancing for the channel and doing lots of different things and working on Today programme, and now he is staff in our team within the space of a year. So actually, sometimes it is just reaching out, making connections to people. You might not get a reply. Do you know what I mean? You might not. And, you know, also I would suggest, I know this is a bit cynical, but I would suggest not giving people all of your story, or making sure that your idea is like, basically they can't do it without you. So you have the connections already. You have not saying don't, you know, obviously you don't have to do everything on the story, but you know, if you have the connections, if you have the people that would be needed to do that idea, when you pitch it, like, just make sure that that's the case. Because I'm not saying that people steal ideas, but sometimes they might see that and go, all right, you know, we might get someone else to look at this. And that can happen anywhere in the industry. That's not kind of specific to certain places. But yeah, so you can, I think there is some kind of BBC Sounds commissioning situation where you can like email in. But yeah, sometimes, as I say, it might actually be easier to go through an independent company that works for BBC, and that's your way in then, is that they can then pitch your idea for you to the BBC. Yeah, so that's probably the best advice that I can give at the moment. I can find out more and I can give you more so you can share it, but yeah, I think that's probably the way that it works at the moment.
Amazing. Well, I think unfortunately that is all we have time for today. But Georgia, thank you so much for coming.
No worries. Thanks for asking me. I really appreciate it.
It's been so great chatting to you. But yeah, thank you so much, Georgia. It's been really lovely to you, and have a lovely rest of your day.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for asking me as well. I feel like very privileged to be part of it. So thank you. And yeah, I hope everyone has a good day.
Thanks so much. And thank you everyone for coming along as well.
Thank you. Speak soon. Bye.